Let me introduce Elinor Sisulu, who is well known to, I'm sure, most of you, and she will lead us through the evening. If the speakers could just come up and join us on the couches, at least we'll be in place to be able to start. So please, our three speakers. Elinor Sisulu is a Zimbabwean-born South African writer and human rights activist. She is a graduate of the University of Zimbabwe, and she was at the United Nations Institute for Economic Planning and Development in Dakar, the Institute of Social Studies in the Netherlands, and she worked as an academic researcher in the Ministry of Labor in Zimbabwe and the International Labour Organization's Lusaka office. She's the author of 2 award-winning books, The Day Gogo Went to Vote and Walter and Albertina Sisulu, which is a biography of the 2 towering South African struggle icons. From 2004 to 2009, she headed the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition, the Johannesburg office, and she's currently executive director of the Puku Children's Literature Foundation in Gauteng. So please help me to welcome her very warmly, along with the others.
Thank you very much, comrades, friends, fellow activists and member of the media. I see one there, a very hardened media activist from Zimbabwe, Peter Thornycroft. I think I would like to start today. I apologize for being late. It's been a very, very, very difficult day today. As many of you know, Morgan Tsvangirai passed away yesterday. And for those who know him and who've worked with him, it's a difficult moment for us. So I'm just asking if we could have a moment of silence, a minute of silence, to respect his memory. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I never imagined that when I accepted this invitation that it would be quite a momentous time in South Africa, having seen the, I don't know what to call it, inauguration, or is it the election of a new president this afternoon? And then, of course, in Zimbabwe, it's a difficult and uneasy time in Zimbabwean history. I must thank Professor Ade for the invitation. I'm really happy to come to a Pan-African Institute. One of the things that I find frustrating in South Africa is this sense of being cut off from the rest of the continent. And cut off just psychologically, culturally, and in many other ways, politically. And a Pan-African Institute is really necessary. I grew up in what was Salisbury, Rhodesia. I grew up in colonial Zimbabwe, or Salisbury, Rhodesia, and went to started off at University of Rhodesia, then it became Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, then it became University of Zimbabwe. So that's an indication of how old I am. And in my first year of work, I was one of the first civil servants in the Zimbabwe government, which we were very excited about, and we were so excited about our wonderful revolutionary president at the time. And one of the great things that the Zimbabwe government did was send some of the civil servants to study in the rest of Africa. So some of us went to Nigeria, to Ghana, and I was one of 8 Zimbabweans who went to study in Dakar in Senegal at a Pan-African Institute, at a UN institute there. So I was fortunate enough to study. There were just 40 of us in the class, representing almost every single African country. And I can say for me, it was, coming from a colonial education system, it was the most decolonizing experience, just to have that experience of studying with simultaneous interpretation, French and English, throughout the year. And I think just being with students from the rest of the continent is a very enriching thing. And I think it's great that there's this institute. And I also admired the conference where people from the Caribbean, from the rest of the diaspora came last year. I think it's actually very, very necessary. And decolonization fervor has been sweeping across the country. And I must say, it's not possible to have decolonization for South Africans without real, serious intellectual links with the rest of the continent. So I'm very happy that this event is taking place. And I'm also very happy to have the pleasure of introducing two very rigorous scholars, one a Zimbabwean and one an adopted Zimbabwean. By now, he should be having honorary citizenship of Zimbabwe. He's been so focused on Zimbabwe for so long. So Jabusile Shumba works as a political economic analyst at the Canadian Embassy, accredited to Zimbabwe, Angola, and Botswana. He also works as a part-time lecturer at the Africa University School of Business, Peace, Leadership, and Governance. And he has over 10 years' experience working with civil society. We recently met at a very interesting occasion in Zimbabwe, where there was a discussion, a public discussion on Kukurahundi for the first time in Harare. And it was really quite dramatic. And, well, it was good to meet there, despite the drama of the occasion. Jabusile's research interests include development, governance, and human rights. And he recently published the book Zimbabwe's Predatory State, Party, Military, and Business. In 2012, he co-edited the book Zimbabwe, Mired in Transition. He's a graduate of Wits University, and he has a PhD in development studies. So welcome, Jabusile, and we look forward to hearing more from you. I wish I could have had the time to have read the book before I came here, but certainly it'll be high on my reading list going forward. Then David Moore is professor of, I don't even need to introduce him because this is his turf, but professor of development studies who previously headed UJ's Department of Development Studies, which also includes anthropology. I don't know why it had, which also includes anthropology in brackets, as if anthropology is some kind of stepchild, but well. And he's currently on sabbatical as a visiting researcher at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, where he's working on a book tentatively entitled From Comrades to Coups, Robert Mugabe, ZANU-PF, and Their Zimbabwe. It's a very interesting title. I hope he's going to explain what is behind it. His PhD on the contradictions of constructing hegemony in Zimbabwe is from York University in Toronto. He has continued his scholarly interest in Zimbabwe since 1984, when he began his doctoral fieldwork, and he has published over 60 academic articles, chapters, and popularly oriented works, as well as co-edited a book on Zimbabwean political history and current affairs. When he's not researching and writing about Zimbabwean politics, David theorizes about the political economy of development through the lens of Marxian ideas of primitive accumulation and hegemony. So that's a bit of a strange way to relax, but that is David Moore. I'd be interested to know if your books are prescribed and read at the University of Zimbabwe. Maybe you can also comment on that in your presentation. So each of our speakers has 20 minutes, and then we will take questions. So I think I hope there are timekeepers, Professor Ade. I'm the timekeeper. Okay. I think I'll try and be as dictatorial as I can. Yes. So we'll start with Jabusile. Can you tell us about politics of Zimbabwe today. We need to be enlightened. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Chairperson. And again, thanks to the Institute for inviting me to add a perspective to the conversation on Zimbabwe. And hopefully, these perspectives will add value to our understanding of the political issues in Zimbabwe. But allow me to say that the Zimbabwean story is contested as much as it is polarized in academic debates. Yet many will agree that Zimbabwe digressed from the expectations of the hopeful masses and many supporters of the liberation project. Insofar as the liberation struggles ended the defeat of white supremacist colonial minority and historic conquest was won. However, the liberation movement in power has proved not only to be a disappointment to the well-wishers, but also to the majority of the citizens it rules. From a very promising state at independence to the grisly images of violence, pervasive economic failure, poverty, and suffering. Several questions beg answers. Why did this happen? How did it happen? Did the ruling elite, for instance, know their choices would lead to Zimbabwe's developmental decline? More recently, on 15 November 2017, the country saw for some a coup d'etat, and for others, long frustrated and keen to see Mugabe's departure. At all costs, the end justifies the means. The latter have preferred to creatively view it as a military-assisted transition. Some, and perhaps uncritically, were surprised, and they have never budgeted, not even an overdraft, of the decisive military intervention that led to the decisive military intervention in the intense battle to succeed former President Robert Mugabe. Yet with hindsight, the events in November 2017, triggered by the dismissal from government of former Vice President Emerson Mnangagwa, the new president, and subsequent military lockdown, paving way for public pressure and a parliamentary impeachment motion that eventually forced Mugabe to resign, are not an accident. In Zimbabwe's predatory state, party, military, and business, I explore some of the questions that might help to find answers or to understand how and why we get here. In this book, I examine the underlying class forces, power dynamics, and the modes of accumulation of the power elite, military, and business. I differ with advocates of the term who have appropriated the predatory state to mean the opposite of a developmental state, or a special variant of criminalization, or neo-hegemonialism. The consensus view for most of these contributions is that the predatory state is characterized by weak or poor weak bureaucratic capacity and poor institutionalization, which allows the ruling elite unfettered access to and abuse of state power for personal gain. Ironically, however, the term predatory inherently denotes strength. That is, it implies the capacity of predators to prey on their targets, and this requiring the strength to subordinate their victims. And I argue that for states, such strength arguably rests on bureaucratic capacity and institutionalization through which the state is able to exercise control. I also argue that the predatory state is a power elite reproduction project characterized by party-state conflation and military dominance in the state. 2, state-business relations shaped by domination and capture. And 3, state-society relations shaped by violence and patronage. Looking through this prism, one will not wonder at the deepening militarization, associated with the appointment of military officers who were instrumental to President Mnangagwa's rise to strategic positions in the state today. Post-independence, the armed forces continued to be the uniformed wing of the ruling ZANU-PF party, in which military chiefs viewed themselves as stockholders rather than mere stakeholders of the party. Was a military solution ability in their party, which was causing instability in government. To this extent, the military intervention was not an aberration, but a manifestation of the party-military relations rooted in Zimbabwe's liberation war. It is a legacy of the liberation era civil-military relations, in which the armed wing of the liberation movement was the arbiter of the struggles within the movement. I have also not seen any scientific evidences yet, but anecdotal evidence that suggests a bullish public harboring great expectations following so-called new dispensation. Part of what is sustaining the support is some low-hanging fruits, policy reforms dealing with indigenization, dealing with the police force that was proving to be problematic, at least if you are Zimbabwean, and for those that were visiting the country. And this has helped significantly of sprucing up the image and possibly to support the bullish public opinion. White farmers are being rehabilitated, starting with those who still remained on the farms, on 5-year leases, and being put on 99-year leases, like black and counterparts, suggesting new administration would want to resolve once and for the question on the land reform. The government has also announced that white farmers will also be compensated. Initially for improvements on the farms, conservative estimate puts the figure at about 9 billion and a higher estimate of about 15 billion in compensation to white farmers. The current administration is thus a transitional government whose solemn to generate performance legitimacy of electoral legitimacy. This means that President Mnangagwa has a compelling imperative to expeditiously hold elections to generate his own legitimacy and consolidate his power. Failing elections is not a viable and appealing option. I hazard the optimism associated with the post-Mugabe transition might be too early. There are far too many constraining legacies and issues to navigate and represent the state, business, and societal relations towards a developmental coalition. I am neither a capitalist nor am I a prophet to be able to make predictions. There are many prophets out there. I'm not one of them. However, in terms of overall governance model, there is a sense that the new administration would want to embrace the Beijing consensus, analogous to the authoritarian developmental state, given the new president's known admiration of former Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, who abandoned most of the orthodox communist doctrines and attempted to of free market enterprise and other forms into the Chinese economy. This will entail liberal economic governance, much illiberal political governance. Model, the economy, and all other things, including democratic governance, follow. The Emerson Mnangagwa already a so-called new economic order predicated on fiscal consolidation, promotion of free enterprise, foreign direct investment, and industrialization to deliver jobs. Externally, President Emerson Mnangagwa is also re-imaging himself as a friend of capital, open economy, and the West. A vigorous re-engagement and rapprochement strategy is being aggressively pursued. It is also showing that the charm offensive is charming many erstwhile hostile countries and institutions. For example, President Emerson Mnangagwa was invited to the recent World Economic Forum, where he met high-ranking business and financial heavyweights, including the IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde and the ADB President. He also met several high-ranking foreign envoys, including 3 from Britain, and is exploring to rejoin the Commonwealth. The charm offensive includes promising a new democracy, free and fair elections, to which foreign observers from various countries will be for the first time invited, including international organizations such as the UN, the EU, and the Commonwealth. If fulfilled, this could be game-changing for Zimbabwe's relations with the Western international community, and will most likely open doors to the international financial assistance and development aid. However, desperation for re-engagement with the international financial community and also the international financial institutions, pressure on debt clearance and associated conditionality and policy prescriptions might not be compatible with the Chinese or Asian Tigers model. The administration might not have the sufficient autonomy to subordinate foreign capital towards state-defined developmental priorities. The economy itself will not be smooth sailing. It will depend. For instance, the economy is currently reeling under a 10 billion debt, which is almost 2/3 of GDP, high unemployment, high expectations. It will require careful navigating. It also depends on the post-election economic policy and the size of aid and investments, perhaps plus debt forgiveness, and whether the benefits of privatization will accrue to the wider economy or they will go in a few hands and the oligarchy that will enrich itself. What will also happen to the rural areas and the disarticulated informal economy? With a full-scale neoliberal thrust and acceptable elections, Zimbabwe will no longer be isolated. Not a pariah, but not like Botswana or Mauritius either. It will likely muddle through along like Zambia or Malawi. Politically, there is a honeymoon that ZANU-PF is exploiting, skillfully exploiting, taking advantage in its domestic and foreign policy. While the economy may not spectacularly recover, ZANU-PF is likely to reap the political gain. ZANU-PF's electoral chances, it would appear, are more enhanced than just 6 months ago in the context of fragmented, weakening, and resource-malnourished opposition formations who cannot match the rejuvenated ZANU-PF drawing on state resources. The future of Zimbabwe might be destined to be in the hands of ZANU-PF, not just for a foreseeable future, but beyond a foreseeable future, unless the opposition pulls its act together. The dominance of the military and war veteran allies in Zimbabwe politics is destined to continue for the next generation or so, as long as the Liberation War generation is alive and politically active. Further, it is unlikely that ZANU-PF will deploy its traditional campaign tools of violence and intimidation, as it is unnecessary to do so given the degraded state of its political rivals. In that context, violence and intimidation are both unnecessary and counterproductive, especially as all eyes of the Western international community are on the electoral conduct of the new government. And as long as the 2018 elections are likely clean and somewhat credible, the economy is kept open, the West is likely to look the other side on issues of political governance. In short, post-election Zimbabwe is likely to see a perestroika without a glasnost. Thank you very much. I end here for now.
At a time, and
Chair, sorry, we wanted to take all the...
Okay, that's fine then. Oh, okay, that's fine, that's easier.
I'll put it on slow.
And Jabu was very economical, so it gives you an extra 5 minutes or so.
Thank you, Jabu. And he was not economical with the truth. Well, given Morgan Tsvangirai passing, we've changed our plans a little bit for this moment. So I think I'll talk a little bit about Morgan Tsvangirai and the history of the MDC up until now. And then I will move to a discussion of perhaps more the nitty-gritty of the coup and what's been going after that, and a little bit more about politics in the current moment. And then, if I have time, the fourth on the list, I'd like to discuss the lumpen intelligentsia in Zimbabwe now, which will go to the meeting that I was at with my two colleagues and friends at January 11th about Gukurahundi, because I was quite worried about the events at that meeting. Right. So, what do I point this? There. So we have Morgan Tsvangirai died yesterday, and he was born in 1952, which makes him of my generation, actually. So I think to put Morgan Tsvangirai in the right historical context is important. And I think if we look at that moment when the MDC arose and had its real moment of power and gravitas and excitement, it was in part of an anti-authoritarian and social justice collection of movements that emerged in the 1990s in the wake of the austerity policies of structural adjustment. So workers, students, progressive church leaders joined up into the MDC with organizations like the Students' Associations, the National Constitutional Assembly, students who had just graduated and were kind of conversant in economic history and were still enthralled in kind of a socialist ideology, were all coming into that moment of a combined in interesting ways with a human rights discourse and a social justice discourse. But my argument, and I think Jabu and Elinor would agree, is that historical moment of optimism and opportunity has passed at the present. Yet I think it will revive. It's inevitable it will revive, and I think Morgan Tsvangirai will be remembered as an heroic herald for an epoch which was foretold in the 1990s with these social movements that came together. And that moment has been postponed ignobly by the current ruling party and its pervasive and debilitating effect on all of Zimbabwe's politics, which has come out in the coup. I'd also like to remember Roy Bennett, who died very recently, who I think is a symbol of white Zimbabweans who came together with the MDC and really did push that non-racial across class and across Africa agenda in very powerful ways. And I think it's also emblematic of a moment after 1999, after the referendum, around the time of the referendum that Mugabe put out, where the private property and the large commercial farms were imperiled. So that made white farmers very worried, and so some of them joined the MDC. And that led to a very interesting contradictory concatenation of ideologies and projects within one party, because we had a sort of white farmer, private property, historical legacy, blending with a working class rooted party. Because remember, Morgan Tsvangirai was the leader of the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, which split away in the 1980s from its mother-child relationship with the ruling party. That was very important. So we had an autonomous trade union organization developing in the late 1980s, led by Morgan Tsvangirai and Jeffrey Mutandarira. And that's also the moment towards the end of the 80s when the one-party state is falling into disrepute. And so the students and the Zimbabwe Unity Movement got together, and Morgan Tsvangirai supported them. I think that's the first time he went to jail for supporting the students, and Edgar Takari's party for deconstructing the idea of the one-party state. And that really started to bring out the violence of ZANU-PF. Aside from, of course, the incredible violence of Gukurahundi, which is always that huge, and Stuart Doran, who's sitting over there, has written what's going to be the classic book on Gukurahundi. Also, I should say that earlier in the 1980s, there was a trade union movement that was severely repressed by ZANU-PF as well. The metal workers were tortured. Some of their leaders were deported. So that's also another moment. It's not, when we think of violence in Zimbabwe, don't just think of ethnic violence, Shona and Ndebele. There's a constant refrain of political violence from this state whenever it feels at all threatened. So through the 1990s, we saw more and more austerity, workers unemployed, more and more resistance, big strikes led by Morgan Tsvangirai. 1997, a really big one. 1996, one in which got the public servants involved. So we're seeing a long, long period of time when Morgan Tsvangirai has led many movements, including the MDC. The toughest time, of course, in 2007 and 2008. There we have, after a church organization arranged some prayer meetings, Morgan and many other leaders beaten up as the preparations for the 2000 elections were taking place. So we have this very interesting combination of social movements, political parties, trade unions coming together. What has happened? Was it during the elections, 2000, 2002, 2005, 2008, 2013? A whole combination of incredible coercion, corruption, finagling, the cooperation of South Africa in letting all of this stuff get by. How does this affect a political party? 2008, they won. Right? The MDC won. They won most of the elections, probably all of them. But in 2008, it was too much of a victory to be swept under the carpet. 47% for the MDC president, 43% for ZANU-PF, but they had to have a runoff. So after March, 6 weeks of counting, when was the election? June. The violence was so severe that Morgan Tsvangirai, in consultation with the party, withdrew. Too many MDC cadres were getting killed. 200, possibly. So that's, it's very hard to recover. People now are a bit critical of Morgan Tsvangirai, saying, he wasn't an intellectual. Well, you talk to the people who worked with him in the 90s, and this was a guy who was reading voraciously, getting really, really good research out there, getting the social movements together with trade unions. But you've got it wears you down. So we get to the question now, where we have a leader dies in power as a leader. People are jostling to get into that leadership position for the past, couple of years, since 2013. And it's an interesting parallel. In ZANU-PF, you had a leader for 37 years who was 93, and he's still alive. What did it take to get him out? An intra-party dispute was solved by the state military. So this is a difficulty in political parties. And of course, those of you who are in the ANC, and anyway, in any case, were watching TV yesterday, can see how difficult it is in South Africa. But it wasn't as difficult as in the MDC or ZANU-PF. So, at the end of section number 1, and how many minutes have I taken? I'm saying basically with Jabu, that if the opposition, which is, what are there now, 76 parties in Zimbabwe, if the opposition that has come out of this MDC moment, which can be, historically documented as a really, really interesting combination of civil society and politics and so on, if that's going to revive, there has to be a revival, a coming together again of the opposition parties. So this thing called the MDC Alliance, has to really come together and work, and the squabbling has to stop. What will stop those internecine struggles, which don't seem to have much ideology behind them? I think it will take something profoundly deep and socially wide across the social spectrum, which was there in the 1980s, late 1980s and 1990s. Somehow that has to revive. Big problem is, though, that with the deindustrialization of Zimbabwe after the economic crisis, spurred by the deal that Robert Mugabe had to make with the war veterans in order to survive within his own party, and leading to the land invasions and the destruction of all of the links, there's not much of a working class anymore. And the working class has generally been the historical base for transformative social movements. What's going to happen without a working class? Can the new intelligentsia who are leading these parties create a new social force that would create something like that again? That's the question I end with on the politics. So a little bit of, so we've had lots of rests in pieces, Morgan Tsvangirai and Roy Bennett, but here we have Robert Mugabe. Did he retire in peace? Was this a coup? Was this a militarily assisted transition? Was it supported by the masses in the streets? How did it actually happen that this soft coup could have taken place within the party, but the military, well, you're going to have to read Jabu's book. By the way, Jabu's book is for sale back there, and it's at the bargain basement price of 340 rands. I don't know if it's discounted for this event or not, but you will sign it, right? If asked. All right. So we'll have people queuing up here to sign the book. It is really, I read that book as a PhD thesis, and I read it before it went to the publishers. It is really a powerful book. We're going to argue about whether Marx is better at interpreting this stuff or whether, you know, but he's got a good take. He goes through these other theories very, very nicely. I think I'm cited once, so we have to argue. So we have a coup which is emerging out of a family feud, or at least you know, was it Grace who caused the problems which led to the new president? May he rule in peace. May he be a peaceful ruler. So if we're talking about early November, right? Grace wanted to be vice president. Now Constantino Chiwenga is vice president. This is the military guy who actually did the real work of this coup. So this is the face of the military business machine that Jabu talks about in his book. And notice the last letter on his name. He changed his name from Constantine to Constantino. And apparently his house has a lot of Italian architecture involved in the design. So, well, you know, we talk about Mussolini type of interventions coming here. Notice a little mustache. How did this, you know, and we have the eminence grise of these formations. So we had Grace Mugabe, who was the public face of G40. Generation 40. And let's not let that word go, because generations are very important in these political struggles. So we had Grace on stage insulting Emerson Mnangagwa, insulting George Charamba, the media information guy, for being junior. Eventually it all gets too much. Grace and G40 persuade Robert Mugabe to fire Emerson Mnangagwa, right? So he comes down to this country and plans with this guy to do the coup, or the coup that wasn't a coup, or the con coup, because remember, it's been approved by the Constitution, so it's a con coup. Chiwenga was in China, so everybody starts thinking, oh, this was a Chinese-supported coup. Probably not. But they were obviously in contact. Chiwenga comes back from China, and the police, now remember, we've got conflict in the security system here. So we have the police who were affiliated loosely with G40 going to arrest Chiwenga as he comes back. They go to the airport, they put on the uniforms of all the cleaners and civil aviation people, and The army does this, by the way. The police are hoping to arrest him at the airport. The army goes there, puts on all the uniforms of the airport workers, and makes sure that the police do not get Chiwenga. And so there's a scuffle, and there's a movement towards the police support unit where the elite unit of the police are. Possibly more than the one person that we think was killed was killed. Some people are saying 9, some people are saying 11. So that's how it works, right? But we'd have to look more, in more historical perspective, at the factionalism within the ZANU-PF regime. So I told you a little bit about the G40, the Generation 40, with its eminence Grease is Jonathan Moyle, who's now nobody knows where, but he tweets a lot. And the other group was called Lacoste, which was the Emerson Mnangagwa group. And I'm just asking, maybe Chris Musongwa is the eminence grise of that project. He was a war veteran in the late mid-70s, when there were also lots of internal factions going on in ZANU-PF, in the camps in Mozambique. And he was the one that was keeping the war veterans, not necessarily the ones who were employed in the military, he was keeping them on board. Going actually back as far as early 2016, when they would march, they would have demonstrations, they'd be water bombed and water cannoned and so on with the Lacoste gang, right? Lacoste, the fancy shirt, which means crocodile, and of course crocodile is what Emerson Mnangagwa is called, right? The crocodile. So we had kind of generational things here, the war veterans, Jonathan Moyle, that's Lacoste and G40. Now G40 is out, the coup has worked, Robert Mugabe was forced, pressured, intimidated to retire. And remember, there was this popular edge, people in the streets cheering the soldiers, booing Mugabe. And I argue, and I'll have to develop this argument, is that if it hadn't been for the years, decades, 2 decades at least, of democratic struggles by parties like the NDC, like the student activists, the regime would never have had to put on this democratic pretense to claim this popular support. It really wasn't popular support for the military, except for the fact that Robert Mugabe was leaving and they were going to do it. And there was another element to this coup. If Robert Mugabe had not retired, given the pressure of the military, the elimination of the police, sidelining the police, no more roadblocks, everybody was very happy, that was another thing. If that hadn't have worked when it did, and remember, even ZANU-PF voted Robert Mugabe out, but he refused to resign on that Sunday night, the 13th or whatever, I can't remember. Everybody was shocked. It wasn't like Jacob Zuma last night. The surprise, the twist in the tail with Robert Mugabe was, oh, well, okay, we'll see you at the next conference, at the next Congress. Whereas Jacob Zuma surprised us all last night by saying, okay, I don't agree, but I'll take the party's advice and go. All done very democratically, of course. So the other democratic aspect of this coup was the fact that, where are we now? Paul Mangwana was a Lacoste constitutionalist, is still, I suppose, and Douglas Mwanzora. Together, they were working out a plan to bring the two parties together to push an impeachment process through for Robert Mugabe. So we had these different dimensions going on here. We had this popular dimension, people in the streets. We had a constitutional dimension, what was going to happen in Parliament if Robert Mugabe didn't resign and if the military didn't really want to go all the way with a real full-fledged coup. So those two dimensions, I'm saying, are an heritage and historical accumulation of democratic processes that made this coup go very softly. Plus the fact that SADC and the AU didn't really want to be bothered with dealing with a real coup. That would have brought in real problems if you had to have an intervention from SADC or AU forces or something like that. Right. So that was a little bit of nitty-gritty, and I have 2 minutes. Okay?
I think 2 minutes is about the right time. Well, okay, we'll forget about Patrick. the G40, this is the G40 coming back. Is ZANU actually together? Is it a united? This is, people who talk about predatory states, they think there's a united ruling party, but they're never united. They're all full of factions. So G40 is not going to disappear, it's coming back. And I think if you look at some of the primaries and speeches and so on going on in Mashonaland Central and so on, you'll see how it's going to be coming back. Ethnicity also comes back in a big way when there's nothing else. When there's no more ideologies left, what do? You go to religion or you go to ethnicity. Okay, the Lumpen intelligentsia, 3 minutes. January 11 this year, Elinor, Martin Rupia, Dumiso Debengwa were invited to a think tank to talk about Gukurahundi. And within minutes, Elinor's speech was interrupted by what I call these intellectual thugs. Start yelling, start saying, no, you can't talk about South Africa, you're a South African. No, you can't talk about Americana, you can't. They were hired intellectual thugs. Now, this is an interesting story for young intellectuals at this university and at other universities. This young man, Tuboy Magwadi, was in 2010 the president of the Zimbabwe National Students Union. Now, at that time, there was a split in the students. Some wanted to be NCA, and the NCA didn't want to participate in the constitutional discussions because they thought they were kind of a sellout, and the MDC students wanted to participate in them. Well, we know the NCA lost that argument about constitutions. So what does a student activist do when he grows up? He either has to join civil society and become an employee of an NGO, or he joins the ruling party. This one joined the ruling party. So I hope he's not emblematic of the intellectuals who are engaging in the reinvention of Zimbabwe. Because if he is, all they do is go to meetings and yell at people and actually crowd over their table and try and stop them from speaking. So that was disturbing to me. Has Mugabeism infiltrated the young intellectuals in Zimbabwe to such an extent that they won't even let people like Elinor speak? In Bulawayo, it was a different thing. People spoke, and they were allowed to speak, but there were lots of big guys around there to make sure people were polite. One young woman was a bit rude, and she ran away, right? Am I right? She was removed by the audience in a relatively quiet way. So to end on that note, I guess, I think, generations come into power, generations of intellectuals. Certain times create certain ideologies that intellectuals dig into. So let's just hope that the young leaders of the new era, which is marked by Mugabe's forced retirement and Morgan Tsvangirai's death, this is the beginning of a new era. How are the young intellectuals and politicians going to take it forward? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, David and Jabusile. David and Jabu. I think what David probably both didn't mention, we talk about a predatory state and about violence, a state based on violent control. But we actually don't look much at how that violence seeps into society and the levels of political tolerance which here in South Africa, don't come and talk to us about Zimbabwe. It was extremely, intolerance and threats. And then when we went to Bulawayo, it was the opposite, where ZANU-PF people tried to ask questions. the same questions, they were obviously given a script, same questions, and they were confronted and they were removed. And despite the appeals of that they shouldn't do the same thing that was done in Harare, the audience wasn't having any, and there was an audience of over 1,000 in Bulawayo, and they made it very clear that if these ZANU-PF people speak, they will physically beat them up. So it was a very difficult thing. And I spoke to these young ZANU people afterwards, and they were very aggrieved. Why were we not allowed to speak? We're supposed to have freedom of speech. And I said, well, unfortunately, in Harare, your people stopped us from speaking. And so this is a kind of revenge, revenge. Oh, but two rights don't make a wrong. But the point is that political tolerance in Zimbabwe pervades into all levels of society. And even the MDC, this is part of what the MDC, what happens within a violence-prone ruling party is replicated in the opposition, which actually seeks to change this. So in a way, the soldiers being welcomed, to me was such a contradiction, but because this is the army that has been suppressing people, and this is the army that refused to accept the result of a democratic election in 2008 and prevent the man who was elected president from actually becoming president. But this is the army that was being hailed as heroes in the street. So I think Zimbabwean politics has been reduced to a very personal level, and it's just who can marshal the forces of violence most efficiently. And in this process, there's a whole gender issue, because throughout this political violence, there is a specific assaults and abuse of women and beating of women that is very much, and I think it's a pity there's been not much intellectual studies of the relationship between political violence, young men who go out and carry out acts of violence for whatever reason, and how that is replicated in the household, the effect on them and their relations with the women in their lives. So that's a whole issue. And I think personally for me as a human rights activist, I was shaken, and I think I still suffer some of the trauma of the kind of violence that women suffered during the 2008 and going back generations and going back to the colonial period. The violence against women has been quite shocking, and it's something that Zimbabwean society really, really has to interrogate itself on. So we are open then to questions. We'll take a round of 5 questions, and then get the speakers to respond, and in the next round of 5. I'm told we have about 40 minutes, so there's enough time for engagement. Maybe we'll take the first 5 from this part of the room and then go to that part of the room. Okay. 1 there, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got 4, okay. Yes, start there. Yeah.
Because I'm a first-year student here, studying a BA in journalism, major in political sciences. Now, my question here goes to Mr. Jabusile. Looking at let's say, the vibe in Africa when we elect leaders, we tend to elect old people, if I may put it like that. For instance, when we take a look into the Western countries, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, I think he was elected somewhere in his 30s, Barack Obama in his late 40s, and the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, I think somewhere in his 40s as well. But the trend in Africa is that we elect old people somewhere in their late 60s and 70s. In your opinion, do you think that is considered to be a factor that contributes to the delay of progress in Africa? Thank you.
My name is Zanzo Moyo. I'm from the University of Johannesburg. My question is directed to Jabusile. It would seem to me that one of the positives that have come out of the coup in Zimbabwe is this freedom or the space to start talking about Kukura Hundi in Zimbabwe. The 1980 to 1987 disturbances. What I'm not sure about whether people are talking about it now because is that there, or it is because Mnangagwa is central to those disturbances. But what I'm more interested in is to try and understand, if you may give light, what are the background conversations within ZANU-PF when it comes to issues of Kukurawundi at the moment, the hidden transcripts, so to speak. Are they talking about? Okay, I thought someone had cut me off because I'd taken too long. Okay. We need to be democratic about our questions. Okay, yes. No, thank you very much. I'll end there then.
My name is Vulindlela Moyo. I'm not his brother, but he's my brother. My question is to all the presenters. I just want them to comment in probably in their personal capacity on what, or if they think this exists. I'm going to outline what I want you to comment on. It's an assumption, but it may exist in Zimbabwe. There has been and there is manipulation of public opinion, public perception, and public knowledge by the ruling party, to the extent that people believe that there is a G40 and a Lacoste when there is none, and both of them are serving the same purpose. It's just drama that is manipulated. I just want you to comment on that if you think that statement is true.
A couple very quick questions, David. You spoke quite a bit, and maybe Jabu, you can also comment on it. I'm sorry? We don't know who you are. I am he who is me. Rukuzwa Murapa is my name, Professor Murapa. I think that's enough. David, you focused on the late Trangirai, and may his soul rest in peace. I was hoping that you would touch on the possible consequences of that death on the coming elections. It seems that both you and Jabu have just concluded that the ruling party has got its way through to the elections. But given the infighting that is going on within MDC, not the MDC, the alliance, but MDC-T, where you have Chamisa, Mudzuri saying they each got authority to be the acting presidents. To what degree is there authenticity to those appointments? And what is the impact as you see moving forward? I had a second question, but I've forgotten it.
Good evening. I am Alexandre Olmedo, political counselor at the Embassy of France. So Emmanuel Macron was 39 when he was elected. So my question is for all of you, actually. Now we have two new presidents in both countries, Zimbabwe and South Africa. So what is your take on the future of this relationship for both countries? That's my question, thanks.
And actually we have three. There's a country which we tend to forget because of these colonial divisions. But there's been changes in Angola, a change after 30, 40 years. It's been enormous and quite a seismic shift. And it's something that we should also think about when we look at these transitions, difficult transitions after a very dictatorial nature of leadership.
Yeah, I think the first question really about old people, I think Elinor already responded to that. But let me start. I think I forgot to mention that.
Was 56 when he came into power.
Yeah, I want to say a very important disclaimer here, because someone said, can you speak in your personal capacities? You know, I'm associated with the Embassy of Canada to Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Angola. But my views that I am expressing here are entirely my own and do not in any way represent the views and opinions of the Embassy of Canada. I think that's an important disclaimer that I want to make. And perhaps at a minimum, they can serve as an extension of my own family, you know, my wife and kids and children, to that extent. Okay, so the first question, my brother, I think Elinor had answered that, but I think my argument goes beyond just people, you know, to look at the state structures, you know, as an important element in terms of how we should understand the problems that we are facing, more of structural problems that are related to the state structures themselves, the relations between the state and business, the relation between state and society, in so as the instruments of wealth accumulation or political reproduction, if you may want to say. I think that's where the problem lies, rather than just individuals, whether they are old or whether they are young. And I think that ties well possibly to the last question, which asked about our comments on the new president. I'm not sure they are new, my brother, you know. Cyril Ramaphosa has always been there in the ANC as the leader. Emmerson Mnangagwa has always been in ZANU-PF as a leader. So I'm not sure really what we mean when we say we have new perhaps leaders. In a way, in my view, they are not new at all. They have always been there in these liberation movements, and they are now occupying. They've been in leadership, and they're just been elevated probably from vice president to the president. So I think they are not new. Conversation about Gukraundi, I wish we had someone from ZANU-PF to be able to answer about the background conversations in ZANU-PF, you know, about that. But my sense is that, look, it may as well be electioneering, you know, on the part of ZANU-PF to appear as if they want to discuss issues that are related to Gukraundi. We know that the commission was, it is way, possibly its mandate will expire, I think, in 5 years' time, but it has already, you know, it's after 5 years already, nothing has been done completely. I'm not sure either whether the government is actually committed to that process as of now, really, that they are committed to it, and there is no clarity in terms of timelines, in terms of the strategy that they want to do. A lot of things remain quite hazy as far as how can they will be able to approach those questions. So I fear that it might as well be electioneering beyond the genuine commitment on the part of leadership to be able to address questions around Gukraundi. The manipulation of public opinion. I think these groups have existed as labels to contest for power in ZANU-PF. Not so much ideological, but just as labels to contest for power in ZANU-PF. Even the G40 itself, in my view, I think, David, you did present those faces. All of them that you presented were quite over 40 years. So that's why I'm saying they're just labels that have been used to drive factionalism within ZANU-PF, for identifying who are your allies and who are not. So they have really, in my view, existed. That's why you do have people that are outside of the country now, and some others who actually paid the ultimate price. We are not sure of how many people actually died during the military-assisted transition. No one has come up with any figures as yet. So I think the labels have existed, and the fighting has actually been more acrimonious. There's a political cost. I mean, there are people who paid the ultimate price in terms of these labels and the contest for power in ZANU-PF. The consequences of Tsvangirai's death, yes, certainly, the Tsvangirai's death will have will be an important factor, particularly for the opposition. Why? Because his terminal illness somewhat had also crippled. It has there was leadership vacuum in the opposition because he was still president of the MDC until the time of his death. Others that had been appointed were merely in acting capacity. So, in my view, I think it provides an opportunity for the opposition to be able to solve the leadership question. Even those Nelson Chamisa, Muzuri, Thokozani Kupe, and so on. I think there is an opportunity now to be able to settle the leadership question, which has been, in my view, an albatross on the opposition. Because without solving that question, they quite clearly were going into an election with serious contradictions in terms of their political formation. But whether this process is going to settle the leadership question in a manner in which the opposition is going to recollect itself and pick up the pieces is a question for anyone's case. I'm sure it will be a very difficult one, and at the worst case for the opposition, I'm sure it will lead to splintering and further fracturing and likely to weaken again the opposition. We are just left we're under 5 months before an election now. So quite clearly, if the opposition is to do anything to be able to present a formidable challenge to ZANU-PF, they need to quickly resolve leadership questions in a way in which they can all come together, settle the wagons and confront. They're so much fragmented and divided at the moment, I fear. So many opposition formations, even the alliance itself, it exists in name. But in terms of how the mechanics of that alliance will work, I think very much many issues remain there unresolved. For instance, candidate selection. How will alliance select candidates? We have seen already there is intense competition and struggles within the opposition over the allocation of seats, which very much remains unresolved. So I think the alliance at this moment is just an associational label that is preferred, but the mechanics around how it will work still very much unclear and uncertain. And I'm not even sure whether there is if Chamisa emerges there, for instance, we will prefer to go with the alliance, or any other leader will prefer to go with the alliance, what will be? So there are fault lines and that are simmering under that alliance. So that's why in my view, I casted really very unlikely, that the opposition will present a very strong force. I would not write them out completely. I'm just saying on the assessment of factors now leading into the elections, it is not if it is relying on its control of the state and state resources. And the opposition at the moment is severely resource malnourished. I argued that point. And the donors that used to be supporting them one way or the other, they are quite clearly looking that they want to move ahead. They want to go on, possibly with a reformed ZANU-PF. Not sure whether it's reformed, but the international community, in my view, is prepared to go with the reformed ZANU-PF as of now. We have had, for your record, 3 high-powered visits from the British government in less than 3 months, twice by the Minister of State for Africa and another, the Commonwealth Development Bank. There are already serious plans about the Lima process being reactivated and so on. The Australians are, as I speak, they are in the country. America is expecting a congressional delegation within a space of 2 months to come into the country. So there has been floodgates of international re-engagement already. Much, I think, to what they were not expecting themselves, but they are already re-engaging, the Western, which means there is thawing of relations and keener to move ahead on the part of the international community, who will play, I think, also a key role in terms of understanding what's going on. Thanks, Chair.
But wasn't it, I heard a few years ago that Mnangagwa was identified as the successor, and I found it very strange, but that the Americans and the British were clearly cultivating Mnangagwa as the successor, and I dismissed that completely out of hand and said we always exaggerate outside interference, but well, maybe history has proved me wrong. David?
If we could turn on those slides again, because I even had pictures ready for the question that Professor Marapa raised, so people could identify some of the names of the horses running in the MDC race, if it doesn't take too long. I think, look, you, from 2005, in the MDC, you had violence, and it was over a lot of issues. We don't need to get into them now. And so, okay, so some of these races go back then. Although one party which left was still has the name MDC as opposed to MDCT. So the MDC, which is led by Welshman Ngube, split off over these various issues. And that's kind of Matabeleland based. So you get this kind of ethnic thing there too. But it's clearly not all about that. It's about ideology, it's about mobilizing people, it's about politics all over the place. If the MDC-N, Nube, can come back into this alliance in a fruitful way, which also has parties like the People's Democratic Party, which is led by Tendai Biti, who's one of those firebrand radical intellectuals who came out of the universities in the late 80s. Which one of these who might become the leader of the MDC would work with these two other, I guess they're the most important extra parties in this alliance. But to be technical about the whole thing, Thokozani Kupe was elected as a vice president. And when was it? 2016, Morgan Tsvangirai appointed Nelson Chamisa and Engineer Mudziri as other acting presidents. Now, that wasn't done democratically. It wasn't done with the Congress, and so leaders do these sorts of things, and the party ends up cracking because none of this was done democratically. Actually, Robert Mugabe was never elected democratically in the ZANU-PF until 1984. Remember, Satoli was elected in 1964, and when Mugabe went to, or Mugabe's representative went to Lusaka to talk to the frontline states as a representative of ZANU-PF, Samora Machel says, "What? You had a coup in prison?" These coups are nothing new. So whoever was talking about the invention by the media is clearly living in a cyber world which is crazier than the real world. These are real things. You go back into the history of ZANU, you see lots of internecine struggles. You go back into the history of ZAPU, you find lots of internecine struggles, even though in 1964 Joshua Nkomo would sign his letters, "Life President." It's a syndrome. But you had generational, ideological disputes in both of these parties. And it's interesting, if you look at Chiwenga's speech that he made when he said, well, we might have a coup if Mugabe doesn't retire, and get rid of these criminals who sent Mnangagwa out. Remember back to Vashandi 1 and Vashandi 2, Chiwenga is saying, we, the armed elements in ZANU, in Zanla, solved this problem, and we kept it in the closet, he said, right? So, and that's a misinterpretation of history, absolute misinterpretation. Chiwenga wasn't even there when they got rid of the Zeno Machinguras and that gang, the Zipa gang, right? So this history is being reinvented many, many times, reinvented again with Mnangagwa's relationship with the evil British, right? Gukurahundi. Why did the West let Gukurahundi go? Well, it could be, and Stuart's working on this stuff, and Hazel Cameron is working on stuff. The archives are coming out. The evidence is coming out. My thesis, but it's a Cold War Marxist kind of thesis, is that the West, and of course the British were always the ones most involved in Zimbabwe because of that colonial relationship, was quite happy to see many thousands of people killed, as long as that kept ZAPU off the active process of politics in the region, because ZAPU was seen as linked with the ANC, and the ANC was seen as run by the Soviet Union. So Maggie Thatcher's head was, okay, Mnangagwa, you've helped us through the transition already from late 79 until 80, until the elections, and much longer than that. The masters of the transitional arrangement between the security forces was Emerson Mnangagwa, many ex-Rhodesian security people, and the British, right? They made that transition smooth. The next step was to make sure that Zimbabwe did not become a frontline state like Mozambique and Angola, and therefore turning South Africa into a communist country. Well, ideology wasn't really that important. It was geopolitics, keep Russia out, right? So that's my probably much too crude interpretation. There is a lot more going on there, but that's part of it. And this history is being redug, and as it's being redug, the actors in that history are still around. Now, what is the new generation doing with the redigging? And there, of course, we have,
these are not these were not inventions of the media, G40 and Lacoste, and they're still around. They're going to come up in new forms. They're going to be lots of Twitter tweeting people involved. There's going to be lots of social media stuff, fake news propaganda. It's going to go on. All right.
I just wanted to say, I really want to bring in, I'm going to abuse my chairperson's privilege and bring in a human rights perspective, because what I would want to see for Zimbabwe is an increase in human rights consciousness and an openness about these issues. The questions about the description of Kukurahundi as disturbances, I think is a huge euphemism. It was a genocide. Let's be honest. And one of the practical consequences of genocide is that people are still sitting today needing death certificates for their fathers or their grandfathers. And the states cannot issue death certificates because then that really gives exactly the numbers of people who were killed. So with Kukurahundi, there's a Tumbuchena report on the Ntumbani disturbances. There's the Chiambakwe report, the state's own report on Kukurahundi, which was so devastating that the state couldn't release. And then we go to large-scale human rights violations, which people seem to have forgot Operation Murambachina. And you know, I find it difficult to understand. In South Africa, when there's a memorial of Marikana, people are on the radio 2-3 days, that whole week. People on talk shows across stations are talking about Marikana. Yet in Zimbabwe, Operation Murambachina displaced 700,000 people. 1.4 million people were affected. I mean, this is like the whole population of Swaziland or Lesotho. And yet it's something which was just put under the carpet. The report was made by Anna Tibaijuka, the UN envoy. That report is not discussed. I find it's unimaginable to me that you have human rights violations of such a scale that just get pushed under the carpet. And I think until Zimbabweans as a society are able to actually talk about all these things openly, we're really not going to have a more healthy political system. The other report, which is also forgotten, is the General's report after 2008, when former President Mbeki sent South African generals to Zimbabwe, who observed the most horrific things. Some of them hardened military people broke down when they saw what happened. Some of the violations included people being beaten on the buttocks and then a pesticide being thrown onto them. Absolutely horrific. And President Mbeki just hid this report somewhere and claimed there was no written report. So these things need to come out in the open in order to create a more healthy and human rights conscious society. And whatever the politics, whatever the ideology, I think that Zimbabweans really need this to have more openness, which is tied to media and media freedom. And I think for South Africans, that's one thing that should be treasured and fought for and defended is the ability to have that media freedom, especially radio, for people to have a voice. We'll go on to the next 5 questions and we'll come this way. Yes, let me.
My name is Bruce Nyarugu and I'm doing my 3rd year development studies. So I believe that there's skepticism about the nature of politics in Zimbabwe. In order asking if there's anything revolutionary about the revolution that happened in Zimbabwe in November. And some would want to ask that, is it new wine in old bottles? If one is to navigate or send us discussion about the issue of awarding or rewarding army generals and chiefs. So can you release that Mnangagwa is trying to legitimize his office, or is just a recurrence of politics of patronage?
My name is Munjadzi. Jabu, you talk about in your analysis that you think ZANU-PF of the election is as good as won. My question is, one, and you also highlight that there is no need for Mnangagwa to be violent. It's not necessary. The rumors we hear that 2,000 military personnel has already been deployed into the countryside. What do you make of that and what does it mean? But also the issue of the G40 factor in ZANU-PF and the Mugabe factor itself, does that not tell you that it's possible that some people who appear like they'll vote for ZANU-PF in the election will simply be angry on how Mugabe was treated and the over 100 people who have been expelled from the party? Is that not a factor in the election? Thank you.
Evening, everyone. My name is Tsawiso Matasha. I'm a politics, philosophy, and economics student at UJ. My question is, we saw with the whole land reform thing in Zimbabwe and how that turned out and how that crippled the breadbasket of Africa to the point at which it became. And my current concern right now is the growing call for expropriation of land without compensation in South Africa, which I perceive as being populist rhetoric just to appeal to the masses. My question is more closer to South Africa. Can't we as South Africans look to our neighbor Zimbabwe and see the mistake which was land reform and learn from that, and looking at the devastating effects and maybe apply that to South Africa before we go on and call for the redistribution of land, because South Africa can turn out and become the next Zimbabwe. So my concern is that. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Tumelo Bore, third-year politics student and member of the UJ Debating Union. The question I'd like to ask is open to anyone on the panel who's willing to answer it. What in essence happens is when we have an oppressive regime and then we come out of that oppressive regime, you have leaders that in essence are glorified by the state or glorified by the populace. This in essence happened when Mugabe first got into power, and it's currently happening with when the incumbent president Mnangagwa is coming into power. Therefore, the question I ask is that how does that affect the substance of democracy in the country and how democracy then manifests? Thank you.
Evening, my name is Audrey Sarombe. I'm a law student at UJ. You didn't talk about Joyce Mjuru. I'm not really sure if she's still relevant to Zimbabwean politics, but I just wanted to ask that, do you think she poses a threat to the upcoming elections to the ruling party? Because apparently there are rumors that she has her own party now.
Yes, they'll have to race through the responses because I think we've run out of time.
Yeah, I think there are some questions I think quite clearly David will take, and then there are some questions that I will take. I think on the, my brother, on the G40 factor, I think someone once said, I mean, it's cold outside ZANU-PF. And I want to take again this caption to say, we've already seen a stampede by some members of the G40 to embrace the so-called new dispensation, a political accommodation of sorts. There are other G40 people, Segrama and so on, who have already been accommodated in that. So I see that in ZANU-PF, one thing that at least I have observed is that when they are confronted with an external threat, they are more likely to circle the wagons to defend the state, their continued hold on state power, which ultimate prize they daily hold so closely. They don't want to lose that state power at all costs. So I think it is more likely that we'll be seeing ZANU-PF circling the wagons to confront any opposition threat as we go forward. I'm not discounting some effect of G40 and so on, but I think it may be overrated in my view, that it will have a huge bearing on electoral performance of ZANU-PF. And then on the Joyce Mjuru factor, I think we have seen how dismally the party performed in a by-election in Masvingo, for instance. I think she has her own party, but the electoral strength that has been tested so far has proven that she's very much inconsequential in terms of the political vote and possible outcomes.
And
That
by the way,
ZANU-PF,
she was recently attacked during a rally that she was addressing recently. She was stoned and some of her entourage were injured. So there seems to still be necessity for violence, Jabu.
I agree with but violence, but not in my view, I don't see overt violence like what we have seen in 2008 elections or before. Of course, the military is deployed there to more of covert rather than overt violence. So I must qualify there that I think ZANU-PF is unlikely to resort into, overt violence at proportions we have seen before that are always problematic for election observer missions. So when the election observer missions come this time around, they may not be able to have all those, that access to the deployment of military officers who are commandeering the bases and, and the election campaign machinery and so on. But there will be pockets of violence, obviously. I do not dispute to that. I'm just saying the proportions, in my view, will be different. In my analysis, I do not say that ZANU-PF will be, Zimbabwe will be better or brighter under ZANU-PF. I'm just saying that the ZANU-PF is likely, to win come the 2018 elections. I think let me end there, and then David can come on to other questions. Don't forget to buy my book there. You might find better, perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, when people talk about African countries glorifying dictators and having bad leaders, I just think of Donald Trump. Democracy is an imperfect system, and if it's not working very well in the so-called beacon of democracy around the world, well, we're all in trouble. But this leads to a global discourse about democracy. And my analysis is that the West, the donors, aren't really so concerned about democracy. There was a quarter of a century after the Cold War when everybody got excited. But at the end of the day, security seems to be more important than human rights, than democracy. I think that's the thing that kept Mbeki and his friends keeping Mugabe afloat. We might have a civil war if Shangirai came in. He might be a bad leader. Let the thing work itself out. If that process had worked, if the MDC had won, they did win the 2000 election, if they were allowed to win that election, they would have messed up. They wouldn't have been perfect, but it would have forced, perhaps, ZANU-PF to get their act better. But instead, what we've seen is more militarization, where we have what the speaker over there was saying, patronage politics with chiefs in the military. Yeah, go to the chiefs, give them a whole bunch of four-wheel drives, get them to vote for people, along with the soldiers who are deployed in the rural areas, right? What I heard when I was in Zim in January was that there was a deal made between Chiwenga and Mnangagwa in 2008. Okay, we're going to win this election for Mugabe. He's finished. He didn't even want to let us do our stuff. This is a story. I don't know if it's true. It's an anecdote, but I think it gives you an idea about the politics going there. So there's a handshake made. Okay, Emerson, supposing we take this thing, you can be president for a term, then it's my turn, Chiwenga. So watch for the term after this term. And watch for those guys who are expecting the next term when Mnangagwa finishes. We don't know how old he is. He might be much more than 75. Show me his birth certificate, somebody, because he had to make a deal, maybe, to get out of prison when he was put in prison for being too young, right? We don't know. He's old, at least 75, maybe 80. Chiwenga's old, but not that old. And those military guys are young and very, very smart. Some of them have real PhDs. Chiwenga is probably not so real. If you look at the foreign minister, okay, I've got to stop.
Intellectuals.
Look at the foreign minister. Extremely well known across Africa for his work in the UN peacekeeping. No, this is a serious thing. This militarization thing is a serious thing. If it doesn't look like it's going to work very nicely in 2018, July, I think they'll go for it. So we got to really, really watch. And this is also this dilemma here that the West is grappling with.
Okay, we kind of like Mnangagwa. Maybe he'll be like Paul Kagame and a really serious dictator, and he'll get people working hard, right? And Zimbabwe will be a new Beijing thing. It'll be really great. But we also have a constituency that likes democracy. So this election is going to be important, going to be very touchy. And I don't think the Trump, the real Democrat, has kept sanctions going, right? So there's not going to be much loosening in spite of the British who love a good military ruler. There's going to be a lot of interesting debates going on up till this election. And so it's very important for the human rights activists and the Democrats to push that agenda. Don't let it slip. This regime is no Kagame regime. This regime is a no Deng Xiaoping regime. No time to talk about land reform,
Thank
sorry.
you. We could go on and on. I'll just say on the land reform, I think it's very important for South Africans to go to the rest of Africa and learn, bad and good. Not only Zimbabwe, there's Ethiopia, which has had an experience in land reform. There's Angola, there's Lesotho. If you do land reform as a thing of revenge and we want to fix this lot of people up, then it won't work. If land reform is done as a genuine interrogation of how can we create a better lives for our people and how can we give them land and livelihood, because unfortunately the discussion on land is not attached to livelihood. And I don't know if there's any research, I hope I'm wrong, but I have not seen any research on how many Black people are studying agriculture, agricultural sciences, veterinary sciences, biotechnology, seeds in our universities. And I think if we're talking about land, those are the areas that at least people should be there. And people should be, you should have free, true, genuine free education to pack our universities with people studying these things so that you actually have people knowledgeable about this and able to actually take over a sector and keep productivity at high rates. So the rest of the continent is there to be learned from. And if I had advice for Cyril Ramaphosa, I would say, please send young people to Makerere and to Ibadan and wherever around the continent and learn and know more about the continent. So on that note, I think I can hand over to Professor Ade. Thank you very much.